Chapter 3.25, Part 5 of Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of America during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 3, by Alexander von Humboldt. Translated by Thomasina Ross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3.25, Part 5. We have now examined a White Sea, note, that of D'Anville and La Cruz, and of the greater part of the modern maps, end of note, which the principal of the Rio Branco is made to traverse, and another, note, the Lake of Surville, which takes the place of Lake Amoku, end of note, which is placed on the east of this river, and communicates with it by the Cano Perara. A third lake, note, the lake which Surville calls Laguna Tenida hasta ahora, or La Una Parima, end of note, is figured on the west of the Rio Branco, respecting which I found recently some curious details in the manuscript journal of the surgeon Hortsman. Quote, at the distance of 2 days' journey below the confluence of the Mahu, Tacutu, with the Rio Parima, Uraricuera, a lake is found on top of a mountain. This lake is stocked with the same fish as the Rio Parima, but the waters of the former are black, and those of the latter white. End quote. May not Surville form a vague notion of this basin, have imagined, in his map prefixed to Father Cowlin's work, an alpine lake of 10 leagues in length, near which towards the east rise at the same time the Orinoco and the Rio Idapa, a tributary stream of the Rio Negro? However vague may be the account of the surgeon of Hildesheim, it is impossible to admit that the mountain, which has a lake at its summit, is to the north of the parallel of 2 degrees 30 minutes, and this latitude coincides nearly with that of the Cerro Untaran. Hence it follows that the alpine lake of Hortsman, which has escaped the attention of D'Anville, and which is perhaps situate amid a group of mountains, lies northeast of the portage from the Idapa to the Mavaca, and southeast of the Orinoco, where it goes up above the Esmeralda. Most of the historians who have treated of the first ages of the conquest seem persuaded that the name Provincias, or País del Dorado, denoted originally every region abounding in gold. Forgetting the precise etymology of the word El Dorado, the gilded, they have not perceived that this tradition is a local fable, as were almost all ancient fables of the Greeks, the Hindus, and the Persians. The history of the Gilded Man belongs originally to the Andes of New Granada, and particularly to the plains in the vicinity of their eastern side. We see it progressively advance, as I observed above, 300 leagues toward the east-northeast, from the sources of the Caqueta to those of the Rio Branco and the Essequibo. Gold was sought in different parts of South America before 1536, without the word El Dorado having been ever pronounced, and without the belief of the existence of any other center of civilization and wealth than the empire of the Inca of Cuzco. Countries which now do not furnish commerce with the smaller quantities of the precious metals, the coast of Paria, Terra Firma, Castillo del Oro, the mountains of Santa Marta, and the Isthmus of Darien, then enjoyed the same celebrity, which has been more recently acquired by the auriferous lands of Sonora, Choco, and Brazil. Diego de Ordaz, 1531, and Alonso de Herrera, 1535, directed their journeys of discovery along the banks of the lower Orinoco. The former is the famous conquistador of Mexico, who boasted that he had taken sulphur out of the peak of Popocatépetl, and whom the Emperor Charles V permitted to wear a burning volcano on his armorial bearings. Ordaz named adelantado of all the country which he could conquer between Brazil and the coast of Venezuela, which was then called the country of the German Company of Belzares of Augsburg, began his expedition by the mouth of the Maranon. He there saw in the hands of natives, quote, emeralds as big as a man's fist, end quote. They were no doubt pieces of that saussurite jade, or compact feldspar, which we brought home from the Orinoco, and which La Condamine found in abundance at the mouth of the Rio Topayos. The Indians related to Diego de Ordaz that on going up during a certain number of suns towards the west, he would find a large rock, Peña, of green stone. But before they reached this pretended mountain of emerald, rocks of euphotide, a shipwreck put an end to all further discovery. The Spaniards saved themselves with difficulty in 2 small vessels. They hastened to get out of the mouth of the Amazon, and the currents which in those parts run with violence to the northwest, led Ordaz to the coast of Paria, where, in the territory of the Sakic Yuripari, Uiripari, Vapari, Sedino had constructed the Casa Fuerte de Paria. This post being very near the mouth of the Orinoco, the Mexican conquistador resolved to attempt an expedition on this great river. He sojourned first at Carao, Caroa, Carora, a large Indian village, which appears to me to have been a little to the east of the confluence of the Caroni. He then went up the Cabruta, Cabuta, Cabritu, and to the mouth of the Meta, Metacuyu, where he found great difficulty in passing his boats through the raudal of Cariven. The Aruacas, whom Ordaz employed as guides, advised him to go up the Meta, where on advancing towards the west they asserted he would find men clothed, and gold in abundance. Ordaz pursued in preference the navigation of the Orinoco, but the cataracts of Tabaji, perhaps even those of the Atures, compelled him to terminate his discoveries. It is worthy of remark that in this voyage, far anterior to that of Orellana, and consequently the greatest which the Spaniards had then performed on a river of the New World, the name of Orinoco was for the first time heard. Ordaz, the leader of the expedition, affirms that the river, from its mouth as far as the confluence of the Meta, is called Urayaparia, but that above this confluence it bears the name of Orinucu. This word, formed analogously with the words Tamanuku, Otomacu, Sanaruku, is, in fact, of the Tamanac tongue, and as the Tamanacs dwell southeast of Encaramada, it is natural that the conquistadors heard the actual name of the river only on drawing near the Rio Meta. Note. Gili, volume 3, page 381. The following are the most ancient names of the Orinoco, known to the natives near its mouth, and which historians give us altered by the double fault of pronunciation and orthography. Uyapari, Upari, Huriapari, Urapari, Vipari, Rio de Paria. The Tamanac word Orinucu was disfigured by the Dutch pilots into Warionok. The Ottomacs say Yoha Apurura, Great River. The Cabres and Guaypunabis, Paragua, Bazagua, Parava, 3 words signifying great water, river, sea. That part of the Orinoco between the Apure and the Guaviare is often denoted by the name of Paraguan. A famous strait, which we have described above, bears also this name, which is no doubt a corruption of the word Paragua. Great rivers in every zone are called by the dwellers on their banks the river, without any particular denominations. If other names be added, they change in every province. Thus, the Rio Turiva, near Encaramada, has 5 names in the different parts of its course. The upper Orinoco, or Paragua, is called by the Maquiritares, near Esmeralda, Maragua, on account of the lofty mountains of this name near the Duida. Gili, volume 1, pages 22 and 364. Caulin, page 75. In most of the names of the rivers of America we recognize the root water. Thus Yacu in the Peruvian and Veni in the Maypuri tongues signify water and river. In the Luli dialect I find fo, water, foyavolto, a river, foisi, a lake, as in Persian ab is water, abifrat, the river Euphrates, abdan, a lake. The root water is preserved in the derivatives. End of note. On this last tributary stream, Diego de Ordaz received from the natives the first idea of civilized nations who inhabited the tablelands of the Andes of New Granada, and of a very powerful prince with one eye, Indio Tuerto, and of animals less than stags, but fit for riding like Spanish horses. Ordaz had no idea that these animals were llamas, ovejas del Peru. Must we admit that the llamas, which were used in the Andes to draw the plough and as beasts of burden, but not for riding, were already common on the north and east of Quito? I find that Orellana saw these animals at the river Amazon above the confluence of the Rio Negro, consequently in a climate very different from that of the tableland of the Andes. The tale of an army of Omaguas mounted on llamas served to embellish the account given by the fellow travellers of Felipe de Ure of their adventurous expedition to the Upper Caqueta. We cannot be sufficiently attentive to these traditions, which seem to prove that the domestic animals of Quito and Peru had already begun to descend the Cordilleras and spread themselves by degrees in the eastern regions of South America. Herrera, the treasurer of the Expedition of Ordaz, was sent in 1553 by the governor Geronimo de Ortal to pursue the discovery of the Orinoco and the Meta. He lost nearly 13 months between Punta Barina and the confluence of the Caroni in constructing flat-bottomed boats and making the preparations indispensable for a long voyage. We cannot read without astonishment the narrative of those daring enterprises in which 300 or 400 horses were embarked to be put ashore whenever cavalry could act on one of the banks. We find in the expedition of Herrera the same stations which we already knew, the fortress of Paria, the Indian village of Uraya Paria, no doubt below Imitaca, on a point where the inundations of the delta prevented the Spaniards from being able to procure firewood, Caroa, in the province of Carora, the rivers Caranaca, Caura, and Cahavana, Cuchivero, the village of Cabruta, and the Raudal near the mouth of the Meta, probably the Raudal of Carivan, and the Piedra de la Paciencia. As the Rio Meta, on account of the proximity of its sources and of its tributary streams to the auriferous Cordilleras of New Granada, Cundinamarca, enjoyed great celebrity, Herrera attempted to go up this river. He there found nations more civilized than those of the Orinoco, but that fed on the flesh of mute dogs. Herrera was killed in battle by an arrow poisoned with the juice of curare, yerva, and when dying named Alvaro de Ordaz, his lieutenant, who led the remains of the expedition, 1535, to the fortress of Paria, after having lost the few horses which had resisted a campaign of 18 months. Confused reports which were circulated of the wealth of the inhabitants of the Meta and the other tributary streams that descend from the eastern side of the Cordilleras of New Granada engaged successively Geronimo de Ortal, Nicholas Federman, and Jorge de Espira, George von Speyr, in 1535 and 1536, to undertake expeditions by land towards the south and southwest. From the promontory of Paria as far as the Cabo de la Vela, little figures of molten gold had been found in the hands of the natives as early as the years 1498 and 1500. The principal markets for these amulets, which the women used as ornaments, were the villages of Curiana, Coro, and Cauchieto, near the Rio de la Hacha. The metal employed by the founders of Cauchieto came from a mountainous country more to the south. It may be conceived that the expeditions of Ordaz and Herrera served to increase the desire of drawing nearer to those auriferous countries. George von Speyr left Coro, 1535, and penetrated by the mountains of Merida to the banks of the Apure and the Meta. He passed these two rivers near their sources, where they have but little breadth. The Indians told him that, farther on, white men wandered about the plains. Speyr, who imagined that he was not far from the banks of the Amazon, had no doubt that these wandering Spaniards were men unfortunately shipwrecked in the expedition of Ordaz. He crossed the savannahs of San Juan de los Llanos, which were said to abound in gold, and made a long stay at an Indian village called Pueblo de Nuestra Senora, and afterwards La Fragua, southeast of Paramo de la Suma Paz. I have been on the western back of this group of mountains, the Fusagasugá, and there heard that the plains by which they are skirted toward the east still enjoy some celebrity for wealth among the natives. Speyr found in the populous village of La Fragua a Casa del Sol, Temple of the Sun, a convent of virgins, similar to those of Peru and New Granada. Were these the consequence of a migration of religious rites toward the east, or must we admit that the plains of San Juan were their first cradle? Tradition, indeed, records that Bochica, the legislator of New Granada and high priest of Iraca, had gone up from the plains of the east to the tableland of Bogota. But Bochica, being at once the offspring and the symbol of the sun, his history may contain allegories that are merely astrological. Speyr, pursuing his way toward the south, and crossing the two branches of the Guaviare, which are the Ariari and the Guayavero, Guayari, or Canacamere, arrived on the banks of the great Rio Papamene, or Caqueta. The resistance he met with during a whole year in the province of Los Choques put an end, in 1537, to this memorable expedition. Nicholas Federman, and Geronimo de Ortal, 1536, who went from Macarapana and the mouth of the Rio Neveri, followed, 1535, the traces of Jorge de Espira. The former sought for gold in the Rio Grande de la Magdalena, the latter endeavoured to discover a temple of the sun, Casa del Sol, on the banks of the Meta. Ignorant of the idiom of the natives, they seemed to see everywhere, at the foot of the Cordilleras, the reflection of the greatness of the temples of Iraca, Sogamozo, which was then the centre of the civilization of Cundinamarca. I have now examined, in a geographical point of view, the expeditions on the Orinoco, and in a western and southern direction on the eastern bank of the Andes, before the tradition of El Dorado was spread among the conquistadores. This tradition, as we have noticed above, had its origin in the kingdom of Quito, where Luis Daza, 1535, met with an Indian of New Granada, who had been sent by his prince, no doubt the Zipa of Bogota or the Zacue of Tunja, to demand assistance from Atahualpa, Inca of Peru. This ambassador boasted, as is usual, the wealth of his country, but what particularly fixed the attention of the Spaniards, who were assembled with Daza in the town of Tacunga, Yactacunga, was the history of a lord who, his body covered with powdered gold, went into a lake amid the mountains. This lake may have been the Laguna de Tota, a little to the east of Sogamozo, Iraca, and of Tunja, Junca, the town of Juncahua, where the two chiefs, ecclesiastical and secular, of the empire of Cundinamarca resided, but no historical remembrance being attached to this mountain lake, I rather suppose that it was the sacred lake of Guatavita, on the east of the mines of rock salt of Zabiquiri, into which the gilded lord was made to enter. I saw on its banks the remains of a staircase hewn in the rock, and serving for the ceremonies of ablution. The Indians said that the powder of gold and golden vessels were thrown into this lake as a sacrifice to the adoratorio of Guatavita. Vestiges are still found of a breach which was made by the Spaniards for the purpose of draining the lake. The temple of the sun of Sogamozo being pretty near the northern coasts of terra firma, the notions of the Gilded Man were soon applied to a high priest of the sect of Bochica or Indacanzas, who every morning before he performed his sacrifice caused powder of gold to be struck upon his hands and face after they had been smeared with grease. Other accounts, preserved in a letter of Oviedo addressed to the celebrated Cardinal Bembo, say that Gonzalo Pizarro, when he discovered the province of cinnamon trees, sought at the same time a great prince, noised in those countries, who was always covered with powdered gold, so that from head to foot he resembled an image of gold fashioned by the hand of a skilful workman. A una figuero d'oro lavatoro di mano d'un buonice orifice. The powdered gold is fixed to the body by means of an odoriferous resin. But as this kind of garment would be uneasy to him while he slept, the prince washes himself every evening and is gilded anew in the morning, which proves that the empire of El Dorado is infinitely rich in mines." It seems probable that there was something in the ceremonies of the worship introduced by Bochica, which gave rise to a tradition so generally spread. The strangest customs are found in the New World. In Mexico, the sacrificers painted their bodies and wore a kind of cape with hanging sleeves of tanned human skin. On the banks of the Caura, and in other wild parts of Guyana, where painting the body is used instead of tattooing, the nations anoint themselves with turtle fat, and stick spangles of mica with a metallic luster, white as silver and red as copper, on their skin, so that at a distance they seem to be wearing laced clothes. The fable of the Gilded Man is perhaps founded on a similar custom, and as there were two sovereign princes in New Granada, the Lama of Iraca and the secular chief or Zacue of Tunja, we cannot be surprised that the same ceremony was attributed sometimes to the prince and sometimes to the high priest. It is more extraordinary that, as early as the year 1535, the country of El Dorado was sought for on the east of the Andes. Robertson is mistaken in admitting that Orellana received the first notions of it, 1540, on the banks of the Amazon. The history of Fray Pedro Simon, founded on the memoirs of Quesada, the conqueror of Cundinamarca, proves directly the contrary, and Gonzalo Diaz de Pineda, as early as 1536, sought for the Gilded Man beyond the plains of the province of Quijos. The ambassador of Bogota, whom Daza met with in the kingdom of Quito, had spoken of a country situate towards the east. Was this because the tableland of New Granada is not on the north, but on the northeast of Quito. We may venture to say that the tradition of a naked man covered with powdered gold must have belonged originally to a hot region, and not to the cold tablelands of Cundinamarca, where I often saw the thermometer sink below 4 or 5 degrees. However, on account of the extraordinary configuration of the country, the climate differs greatly at Guatavita, Tunja, Iraca, and on the banks of the Sogamozo. Sometimes also religious ceremonies are preserved which took rise in another zone, and the Muiscas, according to ancient traditions, made Bochica their first legislator and the founder of their worship, arrived from the plains situate to the east of the Cordilleras. I shall not decide whether these traditions expressed an historical fact, or merely indicated, as we have already observed in another place, that the first Lama, who was the offspring and the symbol of the sun, must necessarily have come from the countries to the east. Be it as it may, it is not less certain that the celebrity which the expeditions of Ordaz, Herrera, and Speyer had already given to the Orinoco, the Meta, and the province of Papamene, situate between the sources of the Guaviare and the Caqueta, contributed to fix the fable of El Dorado near to the eastern back of the Cordilleras. End of chapter 2.25, part 5. Chapter 3.25, part 6 of Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of America during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 3, by Alexander von Humboldt. Translated by Thomasina Ross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3.25, Part 6. The junction of 3 bodies of troops on the tableland of New Granada spread through all that part of America occupied by the Spaniards the news of an immensely rich and populous country which remained to be conquered. Sebastian de Belalcazar marched from Quito by way of Popayan, 1536, to Bogota. Nicholas Federman, coming from Venezuela, arrived from the east by the plains of Meta. These 2 captains found already settled on the tableland of Cundinamarca the famous Adelantado Gonzalez Jimenez de Quesada, one of whose descendants I saw near Zipaquira with bare feet, attending cattle. The fortuitous meeting of the 3 conquistadors, one of the most extraordinary and dramatic events of the history of the conquest, took place in 1538. Belalcazar's narratives inflamed the imagination of warriors eager for adventurous enterprises, and the notions communicated to Luis Daza by the Indian of Tacunga were compared with the confused ideas which Ordaz had collected on the Meta respecting the treasures of a great king with 1 eye, Indio Tuerto, and a people clothed who rode upon llamas. An old soldier, Pedro de Limpias, who had accompanied Federman to the tableland of Bogota, carried the first news of El Dorado to Coro, where the remembrance of the expedition of Speyer, 1535 to 1537, to the Rio Papamene was still fresh. It was from this same town of Coro that Philippe van Houten Utre undertook his celebrated voyage to the province of the Omaguas, while Pizarro, Orellana, and Hernan Perez de Quesada, brother of the Adelantado, sought for the gold country at the Rio Napo, along the river of the Amazons, and on the eastern chain of the Andes of New Granada. The natives, in order to get rid of their troublesome guests, continually described Dorado as easy to be reached and situate at no considerable distance. It was like a phantom that seemed to flee before the Spaniards, and to call on them unceasingly. It is in the nature of man, wandering on the earth, to figure to himself happiness beyond the region which he knows. El Dorado, similar to Atlas and the islands of the Hesperides, disappeared by degrees from the domain of geography, and entered that of mythological fictions. I shall not here relate the numerous enterprises which were undertaken for the conquest of this imaginary country. Unquestionably we are indebted to them in great part for our knowledge of the interior of America. They have been useful to geography, as errors and daring hypotheses are often to the search for the truth. In the discussion on which we are employed, it is incumbent on me to rest only upon those facts which have had the most direct influence on the construction of ancient and modern maps. Hernan Perez de Quesada, after the departure of his brother the Adelantado for Europe, sought anew, 1539, but this time in the mountainous land north-east of Bogota, the Temple of the Sun, Casa del Sol, of which Geronimo de Ortal had heard spoken in 1536 on the banks of the Meta. The worship of the sun introduced by Bochica, and the celebrity of the sanctuary of Iraca, or Saga Mozo, gave rise to those confused reports of temples and idols of massy gold. But on the mountains as in the plains, the traveller believed himself to be always at a distance from them, because the reality never corresponded with the chimerical dreams of the imagination. Francisco de Orellana, after having vainly sought El Dorado with Pizarro in the Provincia de los Canalos, and on the auriferous banks of the Napo, went down, 1540, the great river of the Amazon. He found there, between the mouths of the Harari and the Rio de la Trinidad, Yupura, a province rich in gold, called Muchifaro, in the vicinity of that of the Aumaguas or Omaguas. These notions contributed to carry El Dorado toward the southeast, for the names Omaguas, Aguas, de Taguas, and Papamene designated the same country, that which Jorge de Espira had discovered in his expedition to the Caqueta. The Omaguas, the Manoas or Manaus, and the Huaypes or Guaypes, lived on the plain on the north of the Amazon. They are three powerful nations, the latter of which, stretching toward the west along the banks of the Guape or Uape, had been already mentioned in the voyages of Quesada and Hutin. These two conquistadors, alike celebrated in the history of America, reached by different roads the Llanos of San Juan, then called Valle de Nuestra Senora. Hernan Perez de Quesada, 1541, passed the Cordilleras of Cundirumarca, probably between the Paramos of Chingasa and Sumapaz, while Felipe de Hutin, accompanied by Pedro de Limpias, the same who had carried to Venezuela the first news of Dorado from the land of Bogota, directed his course from north to south by the road which Speyer had taken to the eastern side of the mountains. Hutin left Coro, the principal seat of the German factory or company of Welser, when Henry Rembold was its director. After having traversed 1541 the plains of Casanare, the Meta, and the Caguan, he arrived at the banks of the upper Guaviare, a river which was long believed to be the source of the Orinoco, and the mouth of which I saw in passing by San Fernando de Atabapo to the Rio Negro. Not far from the right bank of the Guaviare, Hutin entered Macatoa, the city of the Guapes. The people there were clothed, the fields appeared well cultivated. Everything denoted a degree of civilization unknown in the hot region of America which extends to the east of the Cordilleras. Speyer, in his expedition to the Rio Caqueta and the province of Papamene, had probably crossed the Guaviare far above Macatoa, before the junction of the two branches of this river, the Ariari and the Guayavero. Hutin was told that on advancing more to the southeast he would enter the territory of the great nation of the Omaguas, the priest king of which was called Quareca, and which possessed numerous herds of llamas. These traces of cultivation, these ancient resemblances to the tableland of Quito, appear to be very remarkable. It has already been said above that Orellana saw llamas at the dwelling of an Indian chief on the banks of the Amazon, and that Ordaz had heard mention of them made in the plains of Meta. I pause where ends the domain of geography, and shall not follow Hutin in the description either of that town of immense extent, which he saw from afar, or of the battle of the Omaguas, where 39 Spaniards, the names of 14 are recorded in the annals of time, fought against 15,000 Indians. These false reports contributed greatly to embellish the fable of El Dorado. The name of the town of the Omaguas is not found in the narrative of Hutin, but the Manoas, from whom Father Fritz received, in the 17th century, plates of beaten gold, in his mission of Yurim Aguas, are neighbours of the Omaguas. The name Manoa subsequently passed from the country of the Amazons to an imaginary town placed in El Dorado de la Parima. The celebrity attached to those countries between the Caqueta, Papamene, and the Guaupe, one of the tributary streams of the Rio Negro, excited Pedro de Ursua in 1560 to that fatal expedition which ended by the revolt of the tyrant Aguirre. Ursua and going down the Caqueta to enter the river of the Amazons, heard of the province of Caricuri. This denomination clearly indicates the country of gold, for I find that this metal is called Caricuri in the Tamanac, and Carucaru in the Caribbee. Is it a foreign word that denotes gold among the nations of the Orinoco, as the words sugar and cotton are in our European languages? This would prove that these nations learned to know the precious metals among the foreign products which came to them from the Cordilleras, or from the plains at the eastern back of the Andes. Note. In Peruvian or Quichua, lengua del Inca, gold is called cori, whence are derived chichicori, golden powder, and coricoya, gold ore. End of note. We now arrive at the period when the fable of El Dorado was fixed in the eastern part of Guyana, first at the pretended lake Cassipa on the banks of the Paragua, a tributary stream of the Caroni, and afterwards between the sources of the Rio Essequibo and the Rio Branco. The circumstances had the greatest influence on the state of geography in those countries. Antonio de Berrio, son-in-law, note, properly casado con una sobrino, Fray Pedro Simon, pages 597 and 608. Harris, Call, volume 2, page 212. Late, page 652. Cowlin, page 175. Raleigh calls Quesada, Seminis de Quesada. He also confounds the periods of the voyages of Ordaz, Ordace, Oriana, Orelano, and Ursua. See Empire of Guyana, pages 13 to 20, end of note. And sole heir of the great Adelantado, Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, past the Cordilleras to the east of Tunja. Note. No doubt, between the Paramos of Chita and of Zoraca, taking the road of Chire and Pore. Berrio told Raleigh that he came from the Casanare to the Pato, from the Pato to the Meta, and from the Meta to the Baraguan, Orinoco. We must not confound this Rio Pato, a name connected no doubt with that of the ancient mission of Patuto, with the Rio Pauta. End of note. Embarked on the Rio Casanare, and went down by this river, the Meta and the Orinoco, to the island of Trinidad. We scarcely know this voyage except by the narrative of Raleigh. It appears to have preceded a few years the first foundation of the Vieja Guyana, which was in the year 1591. A few years later, 1595, Berrio caused his Mesa de Campo, Dominique de Vera, to prepare in Europe an expedition of 2,000 men to go up the Orinoco and conquer El Dorado, which then began to be called the country of the Manoa, and even the Laguna de la Gran Manoa. Rich landholders sold their farms to take part in a crusade to which 12 Observantin monks and 10 secular ecclesiastics were annexed. The tales related by one Martinez, Juan Martin de Abujar, who said he had been abandoned by the expedition of Diego de Ordaz and led from town to town till he reached the capital of El Dorado, had inflamed the imagination of Berrio. Note. I believe I can demonstrate that the fable of Juan Martinez, spread abroad by the narrative of Raleigh, was founded on the adventures of Juan Martin de Albujar, well known to the Spanish historians of the conquest, and who in the expedition of Pedro de Silva, 1570, fell into the hands of the Caribs of the lower Orinoco. This Albujar married an Indian woman, and became a savage himself, as happens sometimes in our own days on the western limits of Canada and of the United States. After having long wandered with the Caribs, the desire of rejoining the whites led him by the Rio Essequibo to the island of Trinidad. He made several excursions to Santa Fe de Bogota, and at length settled at Carora. Simon, page 591. I know not whether he died at Puerto Rico, but it cannot be doubted that it was he who learned from the Carib traders the name of the Manoas of Jurubesh. As he lived on the banks of the upper Caroni and reappeared at the Rio Essequibo, he may have contributed also to place the lake Manoa at the isthmus of Rupunuwini. Raleigh makes his Juan Martinez embark below Moriquito, a village at the east of that confluence of the Caroni with the Orinoco. Thence he makes him dragged by the Caribs from town to town, till he finds at Manoa a relation of the Inca Atahualpa, whom he had known before at Cajamarca, and who had fled before the Spaniards. It appears that Raleigh had forgotten that the voyage of Ordaz, 1531, was 2 years anterior to the death of Atahualpa and the entire destruction of the empire of Peru. He must have confounded the expedition of Ordaz with that of Silva, 1570, in which Juan Martin de Albuizar took part. The latter, who related his tales at Santa Fe, at Venezuela, and perhaps at Puerto Rico, must have combined what he had heard from the Caribs with what he had learned from the Spaniards respecting the town of the Omaguas seen by Houghton, of the Gilded Man who sacrificed in a lake, and of the flight of the family of Atahualpa into the forest of Vilcabamba and the eastern Cordillera of the Andes. Garcilaso, Volume 2, page 194. End of note. It is difficult to distinguish what this conquistador had himself observed in going down the Orinoco from what he said he had collected in a pretended journal of Martinez deposited at Puerto Rico. It appears that in general, at that period, the same ideas prevailed respecting America as those which we had long entertained in regard to Africa. It was imagined that more civilization would be found towards the centre of the continent than on the coasts. Already Juan Gonzalez, whom Diego de Ordaz had sent in 1531 to explore the banks of the Orinoco, announced that, quote, "the farther you went up this river, the more you saw the population increase." End quote. Berrio mentions the often inundated province of Amapaja, between the confluence of the Meta and the Cuchivero, where he found many little idols of molten gold, similar to those which were fabricated at Cauchieto, east of Coro. He believed this gold to be a product of the granitic soil that covers the mountainous country between the Carichana, Uruana, and Cuchivero. In fact, the natives have recently found a mass of native gold in the Quebrada del Tigre, near the mission of Encaramada. Berrio mentions on the east of the province of Amapaja the Rio Caroni, which was said to issue from a great lake, because one of the tributary streams of the Caroni, the Rio Paragua, river of the great water, had been taken for an inland sea from ignorance of the Indian languages. Several of the Spanish historians believed that this lake, the source of the Caroni, was the Grand Manoa of Berrio, but the notions he communicated to Raleigh show that the Laguna de Manoa, del Dorado, or de Parima, was supposed to be to the south of the Rio Paragua, transformed into Laguna Cassipa. Quote, "Both these basins had auriferous sands, but on the banks of the Cassipa was situate Macureguari, the capital of the cacique of Aromaja, and the first city of the imaginary empire of Guyana." End quote. As these often inundated lands have been at all times inhabited by nations of Carib race, who carried on a very active inland trade with the most distant regions, we must not be surprised that more gold was found here in the hands of the Indians than elsewhere. The natives of the coast did not employ this metal in the form of ornaments or amulets only, but also as a medium of exchange. It is not extraordinary, therefore, that gold has disappeared on the coast of Paria and among the nations of the Orinoco. Their inland communications have been impeded by the Europeans. The natives who have remained independent are in our days, no doubt, more wretched, more indolent, and in a ruder state than they were before the conquest. The king of Morequito, whose son Raleigh took to England, had visited Cumana in 1594 to exchange a great quantity of images of massy gold for iron tools and European merchandise. The unexpected appearance of an Indian chief augmented the celebrity of the riches of the Orinoco. It was supposed that El Dorado must be near the country from which the king of Morequito came, and as this country was often inundated, and rivers vaguely called great seas or great basins of water, El Dorado must be on the banks of a lake. It was forgotten that the gold brought by the Caribs and other trading people was as little the produce of the soil as the diamonds of Brazil and India are the produce of the regions of Europe where they are most abundant. The expedition of Berrio, which had increased in number during the stay of the vessels at Cumana, La Margareta, and the island of Trinidad, proceeded by Morequito near Vieja Guyana towards the Rio Paragua, a tributary stream of the Caroni. But sickness, the ferocity of the natives, and the want of subsistence, opposed invincible obstacles to the progress of the Spaniards. They all perished, except about 30, who returned in a deplorable state to the post of Santo Tome. These disasters did not calm the ardour displayed during the first half of the 17th century in the search of El Dorado. The governor of the island of Trinidad, Antonio de Berrio, became the prisoner of Sir Walter Raleigh in the celebrated incursion of that navigator in 1595 on the coast of Venezuela and at the mouth of the Orinoco. Raleigh collected from Berrio and from other prisoners made by Captain Preston at the taking of Caracas all the information which had been obtained at that period on the countries situate to the south of the Vieja Guyana. Note: these prisoners belonged to the expedition of Berrio and of Hernandez de Serpa. The English landed at Macuto, then Guaycamacuto, whence a white man, Villalpando, led them by a mountain path between Cumbra and the Silla, perhaps passing over the edge of Galipano to the town of Caracas. Simon, page 594, Raleigh, page 19. Those only who are acquainted with the situation can be sensible how difficult and daring this enterprise was. End of note. He lent faith to the fables invented by Juan Martin de Albujar, and entertained no doubt either of the existence of the two lakes Cassipa and Rupunuwini, or of that of the great empire of the Inca, which after the death of Atahualpa, the fugitive princes were supposed to have founded near the sources of the Essequibo. We are not in possession of a map that was constructed by Raleigh, and which he recommended to Lord Charles Howard to keep secret. The geographer Hondius has filled up this void, and has even added to his map a table of longitudes and latitudes, among which figure the Laguna del Dorado and the Via Imperial de Manoas. Raleigh, when at anchor near the Punta del Gallo, in the island of Trinidad, made his lieutenants explore the mouths of the Orinoco, principally those of the Cupuri, Grand Amana, Manamo Grande, and the Mercurio, Macario. Note: the northern part of La Punta de Icacos, which is the southeast cape of the island of Trinidad. Christopher Columbus cast anchor there on August 3rd, 1498. A great confusion exists in the denomination of the different capes of the island of Trinidad, and as recently since the expedition of Fidalgo and Churuca, the Spaniards reckon the longitudes in South America, west of La Punta de la Galera, latitude 10 degrees 50 minutes, longitude 63 degrees 20 minutes. It is important to fix the attention of geographers on this point. Columbus called the southeast cape of the island Punta Galera on account of the form of a rock. From the Punta de la Galera he sailed to the west and landed at a low cape, which he calls Punta de Arenal. This is our Punta de Icacos. In this passage, near a place, Punta de la Playa, where he stopped to take in water, perhaps at the mouth of the Rio Erin, he saw to the south, for the first time, the continent of America, which he called Isla Santa. It was, therefore, the eastern coast of the province of Cumana, to the east of Cano Macario, near Punta Redonda, and not the mountainous coast of Paria, Isla de Gracia of Columbus, which was first discovered. End of note. As his ships drew a great deal of water, he found it difficult to enter the Bocas Chicas, and was obliged to construct flat-bottomed barks. He remarked the fires of the Tivitivas, of the race of Guaraon Indians, on the tops of the Mauritia palm trees, and appears to have first brought the fruit to Europe, fructum squamosum, similum palmi pinni. I am surprised that he scarcely mentioned the settlement which had been made by Berrio under the name of Santo Tome, La Vieja Guyana. This settlement, however, dates from 1591, and though, according to Fray Pedro Simon, quote, religion and policy prohibited all mercantile connections between the Christians, Spaniards, and heretics, the Dutch and English, end quote, there was then carried on at the end of the 16th century, as in our days, an active contraband trade by the mouths of the Orinoco. Raleigh passed the river Europa, Guarapo, and, quote, the plains of Chaymas, which extend, keeping the same level, as far as Cumana and Caracas, end quote. He stopped at Morequito, perhaps a little to the north of the site of the Via de Upata, in the missions of the Caroni, where an old cacique confirmed to him all the reveries of Berrio on the eruption of foreign nations, Orejones and Epurimai, into Guyana. The raudals or cataracts of the Caroni, a river which was at that period considered as the shortest way for reaching the towns of Macureguare and Manoa, situate on the banks of Lake Cassipa and of Lake Rupunuwini or Dorado, put an end to this expedition. Raleigh went scarcely the distance of 60 leagues along the Orinoco, but he names the upper tributary streams according to the vague notions he had collected: the Cari, the Pau, the Apure, Capuri, the Guarico, Vaori, the Meta, and even, quote, in the province of Baraguan, the great cataract of Athule, Atures, which prevents all further navigation, end quote. Note. Raleigh distinguishes the Meta from the Beta, which flows into the Baraguan, the Orinoco, conjointly with the Dauna, near Athule, as he distinguishes the Casanare, a tributary stream of the Meta, and the Casnero, which comes from the south and appears to be the Rio Cuchivero. All above the confluence of the Apure was then very confusedly known, and streams that flow into the tributary streams of the Orinoco were considered as flowing into this river itself. The Apure, Capuri, and Meta appeared long to be the same river on account of their proximity and the numerous branches by which the Arauca and the Apure join each other. Is the name of Beta perchance connected with that of the nation of Betoyas on the plains of the Casanare and the Meta? Hondius and the geographers who have followed him, with the exception of Delia 1700 and of Samson 1656, place the province of Amapaja erroneously to the east of the Orinoco. We see clearly by the narrative of Raleigh, pages 26 and 72, that Amapaja is the inundated country between the Meta and the Guarico. Where are the rivers Daune and Umbaro? The Guaviare appears to me to be the Goavare of Raleigh. End of note. Notwithstanding Raleigh's exaggeration, so little worthy of a statesman, his narrative contains important materials for the history of geography. The Orinoco above the confluence of the Apure was at that period as little known to Europeans as in our time the course of the Niger below Sago. The names of several very remote tributary streams were known, but not their situation, and when the same name differently pronounced, or not properly apprehended by the ear, furnished different sounds, their number was multiplied. Other errors had perhaps their source in the little interest which Antonio de Berrio, the Spanish governor, felt in communicating true and precise notions to Raleigh, who indeed complains of his prisoner, quote, as being utterly unlearned, and not knowing the east from the west, end quote. I shall not here discuss the point, how far the belief of Raleigh, in all he relates of inland seas similar to the Caspian Sea, on, quote, the imperial and golden city of Manoa, end quote, and on the magnificent palaces built by the Emperor Inga of Guyana, in imitation of those of his ancestors at Peru, was real or pretended. The learned historian of Brazil, Mr. Southey, and the biographer of Raleigh, Sir G. Cayley, have recently thrown much light on this subject. It seems to me difficult to doubt of the extreme credulity of the chief of the expedition and of his lieutenants. We see Raleigh adapted everything to the hypotheses he had previously formed. He was certainly deceived himself when he sought to influence the imagination of Queen Elizabeth and execute the projects of his own ambitious policy. He neglected none of the artifices of flattery. He described to the Queen, quote, the transports of those barbarous nations at the sight of her picture, end quote. He would have, quote, the name of the august Virgin, who knows how to conquer empires, reach as far as the country of the warlike women of the Orinoco and the Amazon, end quote. He asserts that, quote, at the period when the Spaniards overthrew the throne of Cusco, an ancient prophecy was found which predicted that the dynasty of the Incas would one day owe its restoration to Great Britain, end quote. He advises that, quote, on pretext of defending the territory against external enemies, garrisons of 3,000 or 4,000 English should be placed in the towns of the Inca, obliging this prince to pay a contribution annually to Queen Elizabeth of 300,000 pounds sterling, end quote. Finally, he adds, like a man who foresees the future, that, quote, all the vast countries of South America will one day belong to the English nation, end quote. Note. I showed them Her Majesty's picture, which the Casagui so admired and honoured, as it had been easy to have brought them idolatrous thereof. And I further remember that Berrio confessed to me and others, which I protest before the majesty of God to be true, that there was found among prophecies at Peru, at such a time as the empire was reduced to the Spanish obedience, in their chiefest temple, among divers others which foreshadowed the loss of the said empire, that from Inglaterra those Ingas should be again in time to come restored. The Inga would yield to Her Majesty by composition many £100,000 yearly, as to defend him against all enemies abroad, and defray the expenses of a garrison of 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers. It seemeth to me that this empire of Guyana is reserved for the English nation." Raleigh, pages 7, 17, 51, and 100. The 4 voyages of Raleigh to the lower Orinoco succeeded each other, from 1595 to 1617. After all these useless attempts, the ardour of research after El Dorado has greatly diminished. No expeditions have since been formed by a numerous band of colonists, but some solitary enterprises have been encouraged by the governors of the provinces. The notions spread by the journeys of Father Acunha in 1688 and Father Fritz in 1637 to the auriferous land of the Manoas of Jurubech and to the Laguna del Oro contributed to renew the ideas of El Dorado in the Portuguese and Spanish colonies north and south of the equator. At Quinza, in the kingdom of Quito, I met with some men who were employed by the Bishop Marfil to seek at the east of the Cordilleras, in the plains of the Macas, the ruins of the town Logrono, which was believed to be situate in a country rich in gold. We learn by the Journal of Hortsman, which I have often quoted, that it was supposed in 1740 El Dorado might be reached from Dutch Guiana by going up the Rio Essequibo. Don Miguel Centurion, the governor of Santo Tome de Angostura, displayed an extreme ardour for reaching the imaginary lake of Manoa. Arimuicapa, an Indian of the nation of the Ipurucotos, went down the Rio Caroni, and by his false narrations inflamed the imagination of the Spanish colonists. He showed them in the southern sky the clouds of Magellan, the whitish light of which he said was the reflection of the argentiferous rocks situate in the middle of the Laguna Parama. This was describing in a very poetical manner the splendour of the micaceous and talky slates of this country. Another Indian chief, known among the Caribs of Essequibo by the name El Capitan Dorado, vainly attempted to undeceive the governor Centurion. Fruitless attempts were made by the Caura and the Rio Paragua, and several hundred persons perished miserably in these rash enterprises, from which, however, geography has derived some advantages. Nicolas Rodriguez and Antonio Santos, 1775 to 1780, were employed by the Spanish governor. Santos proceeded by the Cordoni, the Paragua, the Paraguamusi, the Anocarpa, and the mountains of Pacaraimo and Quimiropaca, reached the Uraricuera and the Rio Branco. I have found some valuable information in the journals of these perilous expeditions. End of chapter 3.25, part 6. Chapter 3.25, Part 7, of Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of America, during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 3, by Alexander von Humboldt, translated by Thomasina Ross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3.25, Part 7. The maritime charts which the Florentine traveller Amerigo Vespucci constructed in the early years of the 16th century, as Piloto Mayor de la Casa de Contratacion of Seville, and in which he placed, perhaps artfully, the words Tierra de Amerigo, have not reached our times. Note: he died in 1512, as Mr. Munoz has proved by the documents of the archives of Simancas. Hist. del Nuevo Mundo, Volume 1, page 17. Tiraboschi, Storia della Literatura. End of note. The most ancient monument we possess of the geography of the new continent is the map of the world by John Reich, annexed to a Roman edition of Ptolemy in 1508. Note. See the learned researches of M. Walkener in the Bibliographie Universelle, volume 6, page 209, article Bucking. On the maps added to Ptolemy in 1506, we find no trace of the discoveries of Columbus. End of note. We there find Yucatan and Honduras, the most southern part of Mexico, figured as an island by the name of Culicar. Note. No doubt the lands between Yucatan, Cape Gracias a Dios, and Veraga, discovered by Columbus, 1502 and 1503, by Soltis and by Pincon, 1506. End of note. There is no Isthmus of Panama, but a passage which permits of a direct navigation from Europe to India. The great southern island, South America, bears the name of Terra de Perez, bounded by two rivers, the Rio Lareno and the Rio Formosa. These Parias are no doubt the inhabitants of Paria, a name which Christopher Columbus had already heard in 1498, and which was long applied to a great part of America. Bishop Geraldini says clearly, in a letter addressed to Pope Leo X in 1516, Insula illa, quae Europe et Asia est major, quam indocti continentum Asia appellant, et ali America vel Pariam nuncupant. That island, larger than Europe and Asia joined together, which the unlearned call the continent of Asia, and others America or Paria. Note. Alexandri Geraldini, Itinerarium, page 250. End of note. I find in the map of the world of 1508 no trace whatever of the Orinoco. This river appears for the first time by the name of Rio Dolce on the celebrated map constructed in 1529 by Diego Rubiero, cosmographer of the Emperor Charles V, which was published, with a learned commentary, by M. Sprengel in 1795. Neither Columbus, 1498, nor Alonso de Ojeda, accompanied by Amerigo Vespucci, 1499, had seen the real mouth of the Orinoco. They confounded it with the northern opening of the Gulf of Paria, to which they attributed, by an exaggeration so common to the navigators of that time, an immense volume of fresh water. It was Vicente Yanez Pincon who, after having discovered the mouth of the Rio Maranon, first saw in 1500 that of the Orinoco. Note. The name of Maranon was known 59 years before the expedition of Lopez de Aguirre. The denomination of the river is therefore erroneously attributed to the nickname of Moranos, hogs, which this adventurer gave his companions in going down the river Amazon. Was not this vulgar jest rather an allusion to the Indian name of the river? End of note. He called this river Rio Dolce, a name which, since Ribeiro, was long preserved on our maps, and which has sometimes been given erroneously to the Maroni and to the Essequibo. The great lake Parima did not appear on our maps till after the first voyage of Raleigh. Note. I find no trace of it on a very rare map, dedicated to Richard Hakluyt, and constructed on the meridian of Toledo, Novus Orbis, Paris, 1587. In this map, published before the voyage of Quiros, a group of islands is marked in Fortunati Insulae, where the Friendly Islands actually are. Ortelius, 1570, already knew them. Were these islands seen by Magellan? End of note. It was Jodocus Hondius who, as early as 1599, fixed the ideas of geographers and figured the interior of Spanish Guiana as a country well known. He transformed the isthmus between the Rio Branco and the Rio Runapuini, one of the tributary streams of the Essequibo, into the lake Runapuini, Parima, or Dorado, 200 leagues long and 40 broad, and bounded by the latitudes of 1 degree 45 minutes south and 2 degrees north. This inland sea, larger than the Caspian, is sometimes traced in the midst of a mountainous country, without communication with any river. Note. See, for instance, Hondius' Neue Karte von het Godrechtland, Guyana, 1599, and Sanson's Map of America, in 1656 and 1669. End of note. And sometimes the Rio Oyapoc, Wayapago, Yapoc, Viapoco, and the Rio de Cayana are made to issue from it. Note. Brasilia et Carabao, Act Hondio et Helsen, 1599. End of note. The first of these rivers, confounded in the 8th article of the Treaty of Utrecht with the Rio de Vicente Pincon, Rio Calçoene of Danville, has been, even down to the late Congress of Vienna, the subject of interminable discussions between the French and Portuguese diplomatists. Note. I have treated this question in a Mémoire sur la fixation des limites de la Guyane Française, written at the desire of the Portuguese government during the negotiations of Paris in 1817. See Scholl, Archives Polit, or Pièces Inédites, Volume 1, pages 48 to 58. Ribeiro, in his celebrated map of the world of 1529, places the Rio de Vicente Pincon south of the Amazon, near the Gulf of Maranhão. This navigator landed at this spot after having been at Cape St. Augustin, and before he reached the mouth of the Amazon. Herrera, Dec. 1, page 107. The narrative of Gomara Hist. Nat. 1553, page 48, is very confused in a geographical point of view. End of note. The second is an imaginary prolongation either of the Tona Grande or of the Oyac. Weir? The Inland Sea Laguna Parama was at first placed in such a manner that its western extremity coincided with the meridian of the confluence of the Apure and the Orinoco. By degrees it was advanced towards the east, the western extremity being found to the south of the mouth of the Orinoco. Note. Compare the maps of 1599 with those of Sanson, 1656, and of Blau, 1633. End of note. This change produced others in the respective situations of the lakes Parima and Cassipa, as well as in the direction of the course of the Orinoco. This great river is represented as running from its delta as far as beyond the Meta from south to north, like the river Magdalena. The tributary streams, therefore, which were made to issue from the lake Cassipa, the Caroni, the Arui, and the Caura, then took the direction of the latitude, while in nature they follow that of the meridian. Besides the lakes Parima and Cassipa, a third was traced upon the maps, from which the Aproague, Apurwaca, was made to issue. It was then a general practice among geographers to attach all rivers to great lakes. By this means Ortelius joined the Nile to the Zaire, or River Congo, and the Vistula to the Wolga and the Dnieper. North of Mexico, in the pretended kingdoms of Quivira and Cibola, rendered celebrated by the falsehoods of the monk Marcos de Niza, a great inland sea was imagined, from which the Rio Colorado of California was made to issue. Note. This is the Mexican Dorado, where it was pretended that vessels had been found on the coasts of New Albion, loaded with merchandise of Quito and China, Gomara, Hist. Gen. page 117, and where Fray Marcos, like Houghton, in the country of the Omaguas, had seen from afar the gilded roofs of a great town, one of the Siete Ciudades. The inhabitants have great dogs, on los cuales cuando se mudan cargan se menage. Herrera, Dec. 6, pages 157 and 206. Later discoveries, however, leave no doubt that there existed a centre of civilization in those countries. End of note. A branch of the Rio Magdalena flowed to the Laguna de Maracaibo and the lake of Jareyas, near which a southern Dorado was placed, communicated with the Amazon, the Miri. Note. As this river flows into the Gulf of Maranhão, so named because some French colonists, Riffaut, Devaux, and Ravadière, believed they were opposite to the mouth of the Maranon, or Amazon. End of note. The ancient maps call the Miri Maranon, or Maranham. See the maps of Hondius and Paulo de Forlani. Perhaps the idea that Pincon, to whom the discovery of the real Maranon is due, had landed in these parts, since become celebrated by the shipwreck of Ayres de Cunha, has also contributed to this confusion. The Miri appears to me identical with the Rio de Vicente Pincon of Diego Ribeiro, which is more than 140 leagues from that of the modern geographers. At present, the name of Maranon has remained at the same time to the river of the Amazons, and to a province which, farther eastwards, the capital of which is Maranhão, or San Luis de Maranon. End of note. And the Rio de San Francisco. These hydrographic reveries have for the most part disappeared, but the lakes Cassipa and Dorado have been long simultaneously preserved on our maps. In following the history of geography, we see the Cassipa figured as a rectangular parallelogram, enlarged by degrees at the expense of El Dorado. While the latter is sometimes suppressed, no one ventures to touch the former, which is the Rio Paragua, a tributary stream of the Caroni, enlarged by temporary inundations. Note: Sanson, Course of the Amazon, 1680. Delisle, Amérique Meride, 1700. D'Anville, first edition of his America, 1748. End of note. When D'Anville learned from the expedition of Solano that the sources of the Orinoco, far from lying to the west, on the back of the Andes of Pasto, came from the east, from the mountains of Parama, he restored in the second edition of his fine map of America, 1760, the Laguna Parima, and very arbitrarily made it to communicate with 3 rivers, the Orinoco, the Rio Branco, and the Essequibo, by the Mazaruni and the Cajoni, assigning to it the latitude from 3 to 4 degrees north, which had till then been given to the lake Cassipa. I have now stated, as I announced above, the variable forms which geographical errors have assumed at different periods. I have explained what in the configuration of the soil, the course of the rivers, the names of the tributary streams, and the multiplicity of the portages, may have given rise to the hypothesis of an inland sea in the centre of Guiana. However dry discussions of this nature may appear, they ought not to be regarded as sterile and fruitless. They show travellers what remains to be discovered, and make known the degree of certainty which long-repeated assertions may claim. It is with maps, as with those tables of astronomical positions which are contained in our ephemerides, designed for the use of navigators. The most heterogeneous materials have been employed in their construction during a long space of time, and without the aid of the history of geography, we could scarcely hope to discover at some future day on what authority every partial statement rests. Before I resume the thread of my narrative, it remains for me to add a few general reflections on the auriferous lands situate between the Amazon and the Orinoco. We have just shown that the fable of El Dorado, like the most celebrated fables of the nations of the ancient world, has been applied progressively to different spots. We have seen it advance from the southwest to the northeast, from the oriental declivity of the Andes toward the plains of the Rio Branco and the Essequibo, an identical direction with that in which the Caribs for ages conducted their warlike and mercantile expeditions. It may be conceived that the gold of the Cordilleras might be conveyed from hand to hand through an infinite number of tribes as far as the shore of Guiana, since, long before the fur trade had attracted English, American, and Russian vessels to the northwest coast of America, iron tools had been carried from New Mexico and Canada beyond the Rocky Mountains. From an error in longitude, the traces of which we find in all maps of the 16th century, the auriferous mountains of Peru and New Granada were supposed to be much nearer the mouths of the Orinoco and the Amazon than they are in fact. Geographers have the habit of augmenting and extending beyond measure countries that are recently discovered. In the map of Peru, published at Verona by Paulo di Forlani, the town of Quito is placed at a distance of 400 leagues from the coast of the South Sea, on the meridian of Cumana, and the Cordillera of the Andes there fills almost the whole surface of Spanish, French, and Dutch Guiana. This erroneous opinion of the breadth of the Andes has no doubt contributed to give so much importance to the granitic plains that extend on their eastern side, unceasingly confounding the tributary streams of the Amazon with those of the Orinoco, or, as the lieutenants of Raleigh called it to flatter their chief, the Rio Raleana. To the latter were attributed all the traditions which had been collected respecting the Dorado of Quijos, the Omaguas, and the Manauas. Note: the flight of Manco Inca, brother of Atahualpa, to the east of the Cordilleras no doubt gave rise to the tradition of the new empire of the Incas in Dorado. It was forgotten that Cajamarca and Cuzco, 2 towns where the princes of that unfortunate family were at the time of their emigration, are situate to the south of the Amazon, in the latitudes 7 degrees 8 minutes and 13 degrees 21 minutes south, and consequently 400 leagues southwest of the pretended town of Manoa on the lake Parima, 3 degrees and a half north latitude. It is probable that, from the extreme difficulty of penetration into the plains east of the Andes, covered with forests, the fugitive princes never went beyond the banks of the Beni. The following is what I learnt with certainty respecting the emigration of the family of the Inca, some sad vestiges of which I saw on passing by Cajamarca. Manco Inca, acknowledged as the legitimate successor of Atahualpa, made war without success against the Spaniards. He retired at length into the mountains and thick forests of Vilcabamba, which are either accessible by Huamanga or Atanhuayla, or by the valley of Yucay north of Cuzco. Of the two sons of Manco Inca, the eldest, Sayri Tupac, surrendered himself to the Spaniards upon the invitation of the Viceroy of Peru, Hurtado de Mendoza. He was received with great pomp at Lima, was baptized there, and died peaceably in the fine valley of Yucay. The youngest son of Manco Inca, Tupac Amaru, was carried off by stratagem from the forests of Vilcabamba, and beheaded on pretext of a conspiracy formed against the Spanish usurpers. At the same period, 35 distant relations of the Inca Atahualpa were seized and conveyed to Lima, in order to remain under the inspection of the Audiencia. Garcilaso, Volume 2, pages 194, 480, and 501. It is interesting to inquire whether any other princes of the family of Manco Capac have remained in the forests of Vilcabamba, and if there still exist any descendants of the Incas of Peru between the Apurimac and the Beni. This supposition gave rise in 1741 to the famous rebellion of the Chuncos, and to that of the Amajes and Campos led on by their chief, Juan Santos, under the false Atahualpa. The late political events of Spain have liberated from prison the remains of the family of Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui, an artful and intrepid man who, under the name of Inca Tupac Amaru, attempted in 1781 that restoration of the ancient dynasty which Raleigh had projected in the time of Queen Elizabeth. The geographer Hondius supposed that the Andes of Loja, celebrated for their forests of cinchona, were only 20 leagues distant from the lake Parima or the banks of the Rio Branco. This proximity procured credit to the tidings of the flight of the Inca into the forests of Guyana, and the removal of the treasures of Cuzco to the easternmost parts of that country. No doubt, in going up towards the east, either by the Meta or by the Amazon, the civilization of the natives between the Purus, the Jupura, and the Iquiari was observed to increase. They possessed amulets, little idols of molten gold, and chairs elegantly carved. But these traces of dawning civilization are far distant from those cities and houses of stone described by Raleigh and those who followed him. We have made drawings of some ruins of great edifices east of the Cordilleras, when going down from Loja towards the Amazon, in the province of Jaen de Bracamoros, and thus far the Incas had carried their arms, their religion, and their arts. The inhabitants of the Orinoco were also before the conquest, when abandoned to themselves, somewhat more civilized than the independent hordes of our days. They had populous villages along the river, and a regular trade with more southern nations, but nothing indicates that they ever constructed an edifice of stone. We saw no vestige of any during the course of our journey. Though the celebrity of the riches of Spanish Guiana is chiefly assignable to the geographical situation of the country and the errors of the old maps, we are not justified in denying the existence of any auriferous land in the tract of country of 82,000 square leagues, which stretches between the Orinoco and the Amazon, on the east of the Andes of Quito and New Granada. What I saw of this country between the 2nd and 8th degrees of latitude, and the 66th and 71st degrees of longitude, is entirely composed of granite, and of a gneiss passing into micaceous and talcous slate. These rocks appear naked in the lofty mountains of Parima, as well as in the plains of the Atabapo and the Cassiquiare. Granite predominates there over the other rocks, and though in both continents the granite of ancient formation is pretty generally destitute of gold ore, we cannot thence conclude that the granite of Parima contains no vein, no stratum of auriferous quartz. On the east of the Cassiquiare, towards the sources of the Orinoco, we observed that the number of these strata and these veins increased. The granite of these countries, by its structure, its mixture of hornblende, and other geological features alike important, appears to me to belong to a more recent formation, perhaps posterior to the gneiss, and analogous to the steniferous granites, the hyalomites, and the pegmatites. Now, the least ancient granites are also the least destitute of metals, and several auriferous rivers and torrents in the Andes, in the Salzburg, Fichtelgebirge, and the tableland of the two Castiles lead us to believe that these granites sometimes contain native gold, and portions of auriferous pyrites and galena disseminated through the whole rock, as is the case with tin and magnetic and micaceous iron. The group of the mountains of Parama, several summits of which attain the height of 1,300 toises, was almost entirely unknown before our visit to the Orinoco. This group, however, is 100 leagues long and 80 broad, and though wherever M. Bonpland and I traversed this vast group of mountains, its structure seemed to us extremely uniform, it would be wrong to affirm that it may not contain very metalliferous transition rocks and mica slates superimposed on the granite. I have already observed that the silvery lustre and frequency of mica have contributed to give Guyana great celebrity for metallic wealth. The peak of Calitamini, glowing every evening at sunset with a reddish fire, still attracts the attention of the inhabitants of Maypures. According to the fabulous stories of the natives, the islets of mica slate, situate in Lake Amucu, augment by their reflection the lustre of the nebulae of the southern sky. "Every mountain," says Raleigh, "every stone in the forests of the Orinoco shines like the precious metals. If it be not gold, it is madre de oro, mother of gold." Raleigh asserts that he brought back gangs of auriferous white quartz, "hard white spar," and to prove the richness of this ore he gives an account of the assays that were made by the officers of the mint at London. Messrs. Westwood, Dimmock, and Bulmer. I have no reason to believe that the chemists of the time sought to lead Queen Elizabeth into error, and I will not insult the memory of Raleigh by supposing, like his contemporaries, that the auriferous quartz which he brought home had not been collected in America. See the defence of Raleigh in the preface to the Discovery of Guyana, 1596, pages 2 to 4. We cannot judge of things from which we are separated by so long an interval of time. The gneiss of the littoral chain contains traces of the precious metals. In the southern branch of this chain, which passes by Usma, Villaducura, and Ucumare, particularly near Buria, Los Teques, and Los Marietas, and some grains of gold have been found in the mountains of Parima, near the mission of Encaramada. How can we infer the absolute sterility of the primitive rocks of Guyana from testimony merely negative, from the circumstance that during a journey of 3 months we saw no auriferous vein appearing above the soil? In order to bring together whatever may enlighten the government of this country on a subject so long disputed, I will enter upon a few more geological considerations. The mountains of Brazil, notwithstanding the numerous traces of embedded ore which they display between St. Paul and Villarica, have furnished only stream works of gold. More than 6/7 of the 78,000 marks (52,000 pounds) of this metal, with which at the beginning of the 19th century America annually supplied the commerce of Europe, have come, not from the lofty Cordilleras of the Andes, but from the alluvial lands on the east and west of the Cordilleras. These lands are raised but little above the level of the sea, like those of Sonora in Mexico, and of Choco and Barbacoas in New Grenada, or they stretch along the tablelands, as in the interior of Brazil. The height of Villarica is 630 toises, but the great tableland of the Capitania de Minas Geraes is only 300 toises in height. See the profile which Colonel Deschwege has published at Weimar, with an indication of the rocks, in imitation of my profile of the Mexican tableland. Is it not probable that some other depositions of auriferous earth extend toward the northern hemisphere, as far as the banks of the Upper Orinoco and the Rio Negro, 2 rivers which form but one basin with that of the Amazon? I observed, when speaking of El Dorado de Canelas, the Amaguas, and the Iquiari, that almost all the rivers which flow from the west wash down gold in abundance, and very far from the Cordilleras. From Loja to Popayan, these Cordilleras are composed alternately of trachytes and primitive rocks. The plains of Ramora, of Logrono, and of Macas, Sevilla del Oro, the great Rio Napo with its tributary streams, the Ansupi and the Coca in the province of Quijos. The little rivers Cosanga, Quijos, and Papalacta or Maspa, which form the Coca, rise on the eastern slope of the Nevado del Antisana. The Rio Ansupi brings down the largest grains of gold. It flows into the Napo, south of the Archidona, above the mouth of the Misaguali. Between the Misaguali and the Rio Coca, in the province of Avila, 5 other northern tributary streams of the Napo, the Siguna, Munino, Suno, Guataracu, and Pucono, are known as being singularly auriferous. These local details are taken from several manuscript reports of the governor of Quixos, from which I traced the map of the countries east of the Antisana. The Caqueta de Mocha, as far as the mouth of the Fragua, in fine, all the country comprised between Jaen de Bracamoros and the Guaviare. From Santiago, a tributary of the Upper Maranon, to the Llanos of Caguan and of San Juan, preserve their ancient celebrity for metallic wealth. More to the east, between the sources of the Guaiania, Rio Negro, the Uaupes, the Iguiare, and the Urubesh, we find a soil incontestably auriferous. There Acunha and Father Fritz placed their Laguna del Oro, and various accounts which I obtained at San Carlos from Portuguese Americans explain perfectly what La Condamine has related of the plates of beaten gold found in the hands of the natives. If we pass from the Iguiare to the left bank of the Rio Negro, we enter a country entirely unknown, between the Rio Branco, the sources of the Essequibo, and the mountains of Portuguese Guiana. Acunha speaks of the gold washed down by the northern tributary streams of the lower Maranon, such as the Rio Trombetas, Orejimina, Curupatuba, and the Ginipape, Rio de Paru. It appears to me a circumstance worthy of attention, that all these rivers descend from the same tableland, the northern slope of which contains the lake Amucu, the Dorado of Raleigh and the Dutch, and the isthmus between the Rupunuri, Rupunuwini, and the Rio Mahu. There is no reason for denying the existence of auriferous alluvial lands far from the Cordilleras of the Andes on the north of the Amazon, as there are on the south in the mountains of Brazil. The Caribs of the Caroni, the Cuyuni, and the Essequibo have practised on a small scale the washing of alluvial earth from the remotest times. On the north of the confluence of the Curupatuba and the Amazon, says Acunha, is the mountain of Paraguajo, which, when illumined by the sun, glows with the most beautiful colours, and thence from time to time issues a horrible noise, revienta con grandes strenuos. Is there a volcanic phenomenon in this eastern part of the new continent? Or is it the love of the marvellous which has given rise to the tradition of the bellowings, bramidos, of Paraguajo? The lustre emitted from the sides of the mountain recalls to mind what we have mentioned above of the miraculous rocks of Calitamini and the island Ipomucina in the imaginary lake Dorado. In one of the Spanish letters, intercepted at sea by Captain George Popham in 1594, it is said, having inquired of the natives whence they obtained the spangles and powder of gold, which we found in their huts, and which they stick on their skin by means of some greasy substances, they told us that in a certain plain they tore up the grass and gathered the earth in baskets to subject it to the process of washing. Raleigh, page 109. Can this passage be explained by supposing that the Indians sought thus laboriously not for gold, but for spangles of mica, which the natives of Rio Caura still employ as ornaments when they paint their bodies? When we examine the structure of mountains and embrace in one point of view an extensive surface of the globe, distances disappear, and places the most remote insensibly draw near each other. The basin of the Upper Orinoco, the Rio Negro, and the Amazon is bounded by the mountains of Parama on the north, and those of Minas Gerais and Mato Grosso on the south. The opposite slopes of the same valley often display an analogy in their geological relations. I have described in this and the preceding volume the vast provinces of Venezuela and Spanish Guiana. While examining their natural limits, their climate, and their productions, I have discussed the influence produced by the configuration of the soil on agriculture, commerce, and the more or less rapid progress of society. I have successively passed over the 3 regions that succeed each other from north to south, from the Mediterranean of the West Indies to the forests of the Upper Orinoco and the Amazon. The fertile land of the shore, the centre of agricultural riches, is succeeded by the llanos, inhabited by pastoral tribes. These llanos are in their turn bordered by the region of forests, the inhabitants of which enjoy, I will not say liberty, which is always the result of civilization, but a sort of savage independence. On the limit of these two latter zones, the struggle now exists which will decide the emancipation and future prosperity of America. The changes which are preparing cannot efface the individual character of each region, but the manners and condition of the inhabitants will assume a more uniform colour. This consideration, perhaps, adds interest to a tour made in the beginning of the 19th century. We like to see, traced in the same picture, the civilized nations of the seashore, and the feeble remains of the natives of the Orinoco, who know no other worship than that of the powers of nature, and who, like the ancient Germans, deify the mysterious object which excites their simple admiration. Note: Deorum nominibus appellant secretum illid, quod sola reverentia vident. Tacitus, Germania, 9. End of chapter 3.25. Chapter 3.26, Part 1 of Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of America during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 3, by Alexander von Humboldt, translated by Thomasina Ross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3.26, Part 1. The Llanos del Pao, or eastern part of the plains of Venezuela. Missions of the Caribs. Last visit to the coast of Nueva Barcelona, Cumana, and Araya. Night had set in when we crossed for the last time the bed of the Orinoco. We purposed to rest near the little fort San Rafael, and on the following morning at daybreak to set out on our journey through the plains of Venezuela. Nearly 6 weeks had elapsed since our arrival at Angostura, and we earnestly wished to reach the coast with the view of finding at Cumana or at Nueva Barcelona a vessel in which we might embark for the island of Cuba. After the sufferings to which we had been exposed during several months while sailing in small boats on rivers infested by mosquitoes, the idea of a sea voyage was not without its charms. We had no idea of ever again returning to South America. Sacrificing the Andes of Peru to the archipelago of the Philippines, of which so little is known, we adhered to our old plan of remaining a year in New Spain, then proceeding in a galleon from Acapulco to Manila, and returning to Europe by way of Basora and Aleppo. We imagined that, when we had once left the Spanish possessions in America, the fall of that ministry which had procured for us so many advantages could not be prejudicial to the execution of our enterprise. Our mules were waiting for us on the left bank of the Orinoco. The collection of plants and the different geological series which we had brought from the Esmeralda and Rio Negro had greatly augmented our baggage, and, as it would have been dangerous to lose sight of our herbals, we expected to make a very slow journey across the Llanos. The heat was excessive, owing to the reverberation of the soil, which was almost everywhere destitute of vegetation, yet the centigrade thermometer during the day, in the shade, was only from 30 to 34 degrees, and during the night from 27 to 28 degrees. Here, therefore, as almost everywhere within the tropics, it was less the absolute degree of heat than its duration that affected our sensations. We spent 13 days in crossing the plains, resting a little in the Caraibas missions, and in the little town of Pao. The eastern part of the Llanos through which we passed, between Angostura and Nueva Barcelona, presents the same wild aspect as the western part, through which we had passed from the valleys of Aragua to San Fernando de Apure. In the season of drought, which is here called summer, though the sun is in the southern hemisphere, the breeze is felt with greater force in the Llanos of Cumana than in those of Caracas, because those vast plains, like the cultivated fields of Lombardy, form an inland basin, open to the east and closed on the north, south, and west by high chains of primitive mountains. Unfortunately, we could not avail ourselves of this refreshing breeze, of which the llaneros, or the inhabitants of the plains, speak with rapture. It was now the rainy season north of the equator, and though it did not rain in the plains, the change in the declination of the sun had for some time caused the action of the polar currents to cease. In the equatorial regions, where the traveller may direct his course by observing the direction of the clouds, and where the oscillations of the mercury in the barometer indicate the hour almost as well as the clock, Everything is subject to a regular and uniform rule. The cessation of the breezes, the setting in of the rainy season, and the frequency of electric explosions are phenomena which are found to be connected together by immutable laws. On entering the Llanos of Nueva Barcelona, we met with a Frenchman, at whose house we passed the first night, and who received us with the kindest hospitality. He was a native of Lyons, and he had left his country at a very early age. He appeared extremely indifferent to all that was passing beyond the Atlantic, or, as they say here, disdainfully enough when speaking of Europe, on the other side of the great pool, al otro lado del charco. Our host was employed in joining large pieces of wood by means of a kind of glue called guaica. This substance, which is used by the carpenters of Angostura, resembles the best animal glue. It is found perfectly prepared between the bark and the alburnum of a creeper of the family of Combretaceae. Combretum guaica. It probably resembles in its chemical properties birdlime, the vegetable principle obtained from the berries of the mistletoe and the internal bark of the holly. An astonishing abundance of this glutinous matter issues from the twining branches of the bejuco de guaica when they are cut. Thus we find within the tropics a substance in a state of purity and deposited in peculiar organs, which in the temperate zone can be procured only by artificial means. We did not arrive until the third day at the Caribbee missions of Cari. We observed that the ground was less cracked by the drought in this country than in the Llanos of Calabozo. Some showers had revived the vegetation. Small gramina, and especially those herbaceous sensitive plants, so useful in fattening wild cattle, formed a thick turf. At great distances one from another, there arose a few fan palms, Corypha tectorum, rhopalas, chaparro. The Proteaceae are not, like the Araucaria, an exclusively southern form. We found the Rhopala complicata and the R. obovata in 2 degrees 30 minutes and in 10 degrees of north latitude, and Malpighias with coriaceous and glossy leaves. A neighbouring genus, Brysonyma cocolobeifolia, B. laurifolia, near Matagorda, and B. rhopalifolia. The humid spots are recognized at a distance by groups of mauritia, which are the sago trees of those countries. Near the coast, this palm tree constitutes the whole wealth of the Guarayon Indians, and it is somewhat remarkable that we also found it 160 leagues farther south, in the midst of the forests of the upper Orinoco, in the savannas that surround the granitic peak of Duida. The moriche, like the Sagus rumphii, is a palm tree of the marshes, not a palm tree of the coast, like the Chamaerops humilis, the common cocoa tree, and the Lodiceae. It was loaded at this season with enormous clusters of red fruit, resembling fir cones. Our monkeys were extremely fond of this fruit, which has the taste of an overripe apple. The monkeys were placed with our baggage on the backs of the mules, and they made great efforts to reach the clusters that hung over their heads. The plain was undulating from the effects of the mirage, and when, after travelling for an hour, we reached the trunks of the palm trees, which appeared like masts in the horizon, we observed with astonishment how many things are connected with the existence of a single plant. The winds, losing their velocity when in contact with the foliage and the branches, accumulate sand around the trunk. The smell of the fruit and the brightness of the verdure attract from afar the birds of passage, which love to perch on the slender, arrow-like branches of the palm tree. A soft murmuring is heard around, and, overpowered by the heat, and accustomed to the melancholy silence of the plains, the traveller imagines he enjoys some degree of coolness on hearing the slightest sound of the foliage. If we examine the soil on the side opposite to the wind, we find it remains humid long after the rainy season. Insects and worms, everywhere else so rare in the Llanos, here assemble and multiply. This one solitary and often stunted tree, which would not claim the notice of the traveller amid the forests of the Orinoco, spreads life around it in the desert. On the 13th of July we arrived at the village of Cari, the first of the Caribbee missions that are under the Observantin monks of the college of Piritu. We lodged as usual at the convent, that is, with the clergyman. Our host could scarcely comprehend how natives of the north of Europe could arrive at his dwelling from the frontiers of Brazil by the Rio Negro, and not by way of the coast of Cumana. He behaved to us in the most affable manner, at the same time manifesting that somewhat importunate curiosity which the appearance of a stranger, not a Spaniard, always excites in South America. He expressed his belief that the minerals we had collected must contain gold, and that the plants, dried with so much care, must be medicinal. Here, as in many parts of Europe, the sciences are thought worthy to occupy the mind only so far as they confer some immediate and practical benefit on society. We found more than 500 Caribs in the village of Cari, and saw many others in the surrounding missions. It is curious to observe this nomad people, recently attached to the soil, and differing from all the other Indians in their physical and intellectual powers. They are a very tall race of men, their height being from 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 10 inches. According to a practice common in America, the women are more sparingly clothed than the men. The former wear only the guajuco or perizoma in the form of a band. The men have the lower part of the body wrapped in a piece of blue cloth, so dark as to be almost black. This drapery is so ample that on the lowering of the temperature towards evening, the Caribs throw it over their shoulders. Their bodies tinged with onoto, note, roku, obtained from the Bija Orellana. This paint is called in the Carib tongue bichet. Their tall figures, of a reddish copper colour, and their picturesque drapery, when seen from a distance, relieved against the sky as a background, resemble antique statues of bronze. The men cut their hair in a very peculiar manner, very much in the style of the monks. A part of the forehead is shaved, which makes it appear extremely high, and a circular tuft of hair is left near the crown of the head. This resemblance between the Caribs and the monks is not the result of mission life. It is not caused, as has been erroneously supposed, by the desire of the natives to imitate their masters, the Franciscan monks. The tribes that preserve their wild independence between the sources of the Caroni and the Rio Branco are distinguished by the same cerquillo de frailes, note, circular tonsure of the friars, which the early Spanish historians, at the time of the discovery of America, attributed to the nations of the Carib race. All the men of this race whom we saw, either during our voyage on the lower Orinoco or in the missions of Piritu, differ from the other Indians, not only in the tallness of their stature, but also in the regularity of their features. Their noses are smaller and less flattened, the cheekbones are not so high, and their physiognomy has less of the Mongol character. Their eyes, which are darker than those of the other hordes of Guiana, denote intelligence, and it may even be said, the habit of reflection. The Caribs have a gravity of manner, and a certain look of sadness, which is observable among most of the primitive inhabitants of the New World. The expression of severity in their features is heightened by the practice of dyeing their eyebrows with the juice of caruto. They also lengthen their eyebrows, thereby giving them the appearance of being joined together. And they often mark their faces all over with black spots, to give themselves a more fierce appearance. The Carib women are less robust and good-looking than the men. On them devolves almost the whole burden of domestic work, as well as much of the outdoor labour. They asked us eagerly for pins, which they stuck under their lower lip, making the head of the pin penetrate deeply into the skin. The young girls are painted red, and are almost naked. Among the different nations of the Old and the New Worlds, the idea of nudity is altogether relative. A woman in some parts of Asia is not permitted to show the tips of her fingers, while an Indian of the Carib race is far from considering herself unclothed if she wear round her waist a guajuco 2 inches broad. Even this band is regarded as less essential than the pigment which covers the skin. To go out of the hut without being painted would be to transgress all the rules of Carib decency. The Indians of the missions of Piritu especially attracted our attention, because they belong to a nation which, by its daring, its warlike enterprises, and its mercantile spirit, has exercised great influence over the vast country extending from the equator towards the northern coast. Everywhere on the Orinoco we beheld traces of the hostile incursions of the Caribs, incursions which heretofore extended from the sources of the Caroni and the Erevato as far as the banks of the Ventuari, the Atacave, and the Rio Negro. The Carib language is consequently the most general in this part of the world. It has even passed, like the language of the Leninanapis or Algonquins, and the Natchez or Muskogees, on the west of the Allegheny Mountains, to tribes which have not a common origin. When we survey that multitude of nations spread over North and South America, eastward of the Cordilleras of the Andes, we fix our attention particularly on those who, having long held dominion over their neighbours, have acted an important part on the stage of the world. It is the business of the historian to group facts, to distinguish masses, to ascend to the common sources of many migrations and popular movements. Great empires, the regular organization of a sacerdotal hierarchy, and the culture which that organization favors in the first stages of society, have existed only on the high mountains of the Western world. In Mexico we see a vast monarchy enclosing small republics. At Cundinamarca and Peru we find pure theocracies, fortified towns, highways, and large edifices of stone, an extraordinary development of the feudal system, the separation of castes, convents of men and women, religious congregations regulated by discipline more or less severe, complicated divisions of time connected with the calendars, the zodiacs, and the astrology of the enlightened nations of Asia. All these phenomena in America belong to one region only, the long and narrow alpine band, extending from the 30th degree of north latitude to the 25th degree of south. The migration of nations in the ancient world was from east to west. The Basques or Iberians, the Celts, the Germans, and the Pelasgi appeared in succession. In the New World, similar migrations flowed from north to south. Among the nations that inhabit the two hemispheres, the direction of this movement followed that of the mountains. But in the torrid zone, the temperate tablelands of the Cordilleras had greater influence on the destiny of mankind than the mountains of Asia and Central Europe. As, properly speaking, only civilized nations have a history, the history of the Americans is necessarily no more than that of a small portion of the inhabitants of the mountains. Profound obscurity envelops the vast country which stretches from the eastern slope of the Cordilleras towards the Atlantic, and for this very reason, whatever in that country relates to a preponderance of one nation over others, to distant migrations, to the physiognomical features which denote a foreign race, excite our deepest interest. Amidst the plains of North America, some powerful nation, which has disappeared, constructed circular, square, and octagonal fortifications, walls 6,000 toises in length, tumuli from 700 to 800 feet in diameter, and 140 feet in height, sometimes round, sometimes with several stories and containing thousands of skeletons. These skeletons are the remains of men less slender and more squat than the present inhabitants of those countries. Other bones wrapped in fabrics resembling those of the Sandwich and Fiji Islands are found in the natural grottos of Kentucky. What has become of those nations of Louisiana, anterior to the Lenni Lenapes, the Shawanese, and perhaps even to the Sioux, Nadowesses, Nakotas of the Missouri, who are strongly Mongolized, and who, it is believed, according to their own traditions, came from the coast of Asia? In the plains of South America we find only a very few hillocks of that kind called cerros hechos a mano, hills made by the hand, or artificial hills, and nowhere any works of fortification analogous to those of the Ohio. However, on a vast space of ground, at the lower Orinoco, as well as on the banks of the Cassiquiare, and between the sources of the Essequibo and the Rio Branco, there are rocks of granite covered with symbolic figures. These sculptures denote that the extinct generations belong to nations different from those which now inhabit the same regions. There seems to be no connection between the history of Mexico and that of Cundinamarca and of Peru, but in the plains of the east a warlike and long dominant nation betrays in its features and its physical constitution traces of a foreign origin. The Caribs preserve traditions that seem to indicate ancient communications between North and South America. Such a phenomenon deserves particular attention. If it be true that savages are for the most part degenerate races, remnants escaped from a common wreck, as their languages, their cosmogonic fables, and numerous other indications seem to prove, it becomes doubly important to examine the course by which these remnants have been driven from one hemisphere to the other. That fine race of people, the Caribs, now occupy only a small part of the country which they inhabited at the time of the discovery of America. The cruelties exercised by Europeans have entirely exterminated them from the West Indian islands and the coasts of Darien, while under the government of the missions they have formed populous villages in the provinces of New Barcelona and Spanish Guiana. The Caribs who inhabit the Llanos of Piritu and the banks of the Caroni and the Cuyuni may be established at more than 35,000. If we add to this number the independent Caribs who live westward of the mountains of Cayenne and Pacaraimo, between the sources of the Essequibo and the Rio Branco, we shall no doubt obtain a total of 40,000 individuals of pure race, unmixed with any other tribes of natives. Prior to my travels, the Caribs were mentioned in many geographical works as an extinct race. Writers unacquainted with the interior of the Spanish colonies of the continent supposed that the small islands of Dominica, Guadalupe, and St. Vincent had been the principal abodes of that nation, of which the only vestiges now remaining throughout the whole of the eastern West India Islands are skeletons petrified, or rather enveloped in a limestone containing madrepores. Note: these skeletons were discovered in 1805 by M. Cortez. They are encased in a formation of madrepore breccia, which the negroes call God's masonry, and which, like the travertin of Italy, envelops fragments of vases or other fragments created by human skill. M. Daucian-Lavez and Dr. Koenig first made known in Europe this phenomenon, which has greatly interested geologists. End of note. The name of Caribs, which I find for the first time in a letter of Peter Martyr Tangira, is derived from Kalina and Caripuna, the I and P being transferred into R and B. It is very remarkable that this name, which Columbus heard pronounced by the people of Haiti, was known to exist at the same time among the Caribs of the islands and those of the continent. From the word Carina or Kalina has formed Galibi, Caribi. This is the distinctive denomination of a tribe in French Guiana, who are of a much more diminutive stature than the inhabitants of Cari, but speaking one of the numerous dialects of the Carib tongue. Note: the Galibis, Calibitis, the Palicours, and the Acoquoas also cut their hair in the style of the monks, and apply bandages to the legs of their children for the purpose of swelling the muscles. They have the same predilection for green stones, saussurite, which we observed among the Carib nations of the Orinoco. There exist, besides, in French Guiana, 20 Indian tribes, which are distinguished from the Galibis, though their language proves that they have a common origin. End of note. The inhabitants of the islands are called Kalinago in the language of the men, and in that of the women, Kalapinan. The difference in the language between the two sexes is more striking among the people of the Carib race than among other American nations, the Omaguas, the Guaranis, and the Chiquitos, where it applies only to a limited number of ideas. For instance, the words mother and child. It may be conceived that women, from their separate way of life, frame particular terms which men do not adopt. Cicero observes that old forms of language are best preserved by women, because by their position in society they are less exposed to those vicissitudes of life, changes of place and occupation, which tend to corrupt the primitive purity of language among men. Note: Cicero, de Orat Lib. 3 Cap. 12 paragraph. 45 ed. Verberg. Facilius enim mulieris in corruptum antiquitatem conservant, quod matorum sermonis expertis ea tenent semper, quae prima didicerunt. End of note. But in the Carib nations the contrast between the dialect of the two sexes is so great that to explain it satisfactorily we must refer to another cause, and this may perhaps be found in the barbarous custom practised by those nations of killing their male prisoners and carrying the wives of the vanquished into captivity. When the Caribs made an irruption into the archipelago of the West India Islands, they arrived there as a band of warriors, not as colonists accompanied by their families. The language of the female sex was formed by degrees, as the conquerors contracted alliances with the foreign women. It was composed of new elements, words distinct from the Carib words, which in the interior of the gynaeceums were transmitted from generation to generation, but on which the structure, the combinations, the grammatical forms of the language of the men exercised an influence. Note: the following are examples of the difference between the language of the men, M, and the women, W. Isle, Ubao, M. Asira, W. Man, Uakili, M. Airi, W. But, Irhen, M. Attica, W.). There was then manifested in a small community the peculiarity which we now find in the whole group of the nations of the new continent. The American languages, from Hudson's Bay to the Straits of Magellan, are in general characterized by a total disparity of words, combined with a great analogy in their structure. They are like different substances invested with analogous forms. If we recollect that this phenomenon extends over 1/2 of our planet, almost from pole to pole; if we consider the shades in the grammatical forms, the genders applied to the 3 persons of the verb, the reduplications, the frequentatives, the duals, it appears highly astonishing to find a uniform tendency in the development of intelligence and language among so considerable a portion of the human race. Chapter 3.26. Part 1.